I learned something about powerful men the night I stepped into the wrong car. The most dangerous ones don't look dangerous at all. It was raining, the kind of slow, steady rain that makes every streetlight glow like melted gold and every sidewalk shine like glass. My shift at the downtown hotel had ended 20 minutes earlier, and my feet hurt the way they always did after 10 hours of carrying trays and pretending expensive people didn't look through me like I was part of the furniture. I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped outside into the cool Chicago night, the air smelling like wet pavement and car exhaust. The rideshare app on my phone showed my driver arriving in 2 minutes, a black sedan waiting at the curb beneath a flickering street lamp. I didn't think much about it. I just opened the back door and slid into the seat, shaking rain from my hair. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something clean, like cedar or expensive soap. "Long night?" the driver asked quietly. His voice was calm, low, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be heard. I glanced up from my phone and saw his reflection in the rearview mirror for the first time. Dark hair, sharp jawline, eyes focused on the road like nothing in the world surprised him. He looked maybe early 30s, dressed in a simple black jacket that fit him a little too perfectly to belong to someone who spent his nights driving strangers around. "You could say that," I said, letting out a tired laugh. 10 hours of smiling at people who complain about sparkling water. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, almost a smile. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, the engine so quiet I barely noticed we were moving until the hotel lights faded behind us. Outside the window, the city blurred into streaks of yellow and white, rain tapping gently against the glass like fingertips. Something about the silence in the car felt different from the usual rideshare awkwardness. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was deliberate, like he was choosing every word carefully. "You work there every night?" he asked. "Most nights," I said. "Tips pay the rent." I studied him again in the mirror. Drivers usually filled the silence with small talk about traffic or weather or sports. This one didn't. His hands rested loosely on the steering wheel, steady and confident, like someone who had spent a lifetime in control of moving things forward. For a moment, I wondered why someone like him would be driving rideshare at midnight. But then again, Chicago was full of people with stories you never asked about. We stopped at a red light, and the glow from a nearby diner sign spilled through the windshield, lighting his face just enough for me to see the calm focus in his eyes. He didn't look tired. He didn't look bored. He looked like a man who was exactly where he meant to be. "What's your name?" I asked. "Adrian," he said. "Just Adrian." No extra conversation, no rehearsed friendliness. The light turned green, and the car moved again, smooth and quiet through the rain. I leaned my head back against the seat, exhaustion finally catching up with me. At that moment, Adrian Volkov was just a driver, and I had absolutely no idea that getting into his car was the first step toward a world I wasn't supposed to see. I did not expect to see him again. Chicago is a city of millions of people, and most strangers disappear into it the moment a car door closes. That is how it usually works. You get in, you make small talk, you step out, and the person behind the wheel becomes another face you never remember. But the next night, just after 11:30, when my shift ended and the cold wind pushed through the tall buildings on Michigan Avenue, I opened my rideshare app and saw the same black sedan icon waiting at the curb. When I stepped outside, the rain had stopped, but the pavement still shined under the streetlights, reflecting the hotel sign like a pool of gold. The car door opened automatically as I approached, and when I slid into the back seat, I saw those same calm eyes in the rearview mirror. "Adrian." For a moment, I wondered if the app had matched me with the same driver by coincidence. Chicago was large, but not infinite. "Good evening, Emily," he said quietly. The sound of my name made me pause. "You remember my name?" I asked. Drivers rarely did. They usually relied on the app notification or asked again politely. Adrian nodded slightly while guiding the car into the slow midnight traffic. "You work late shifts." The hotel closes the restaurant around 11:30. It was a reasonable guess. His answer sounded simple, but something about it made me smile. "Still impressive," I said. The car moved smoothly through the glowing city streets, passing rows of restaurants and quiet office buildings where only a few windows still held light. The inside of the car felt warm and calm, like a quiet pocket hidden from the rest of the city. I leaned back in the seat, letting the long day slowly fall off my shoulders. "Do you drive every night?" I asked. Most nights, he replied. His hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, steady and precise. I noticed again how composed he seemed. No rushing. No impatient tapping on the wheel when traffic slowed. Just quiet control. At the next stoplight, a group of men in dark suits crossed the street in front of us. One of them glanced toward the car, and for a brief second his expression changed, almost like recognition, before he quickly looked away. I did not think much about it then. In a city like Chicago, expensive suits were not unusual. The light turned green, and Adrian drove on without saying anything. You must meet a lot of strange people doing this job, I said. Sometimes, he answered. Most people are simply tired. I laughed softly because that was exactly how I felt every night. Outside the window, the skyline stretched across the horizon, tall glass towers reflecting the moonlight. The city looked powerful from a distance, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Adrian pulled up in front of my small apartment building on the north side, the engine humming quietly as the car stopped. I reached for the door handle, then hesitated. Thank you again, I said, for the quiet ride. Adrian met my eyes in the mirror for a brief moment. There was something thoughtful in his expression, like he was measuring every word before speaking. You are welcome, Emily. I stepped out of the car, and the cold air wrapped around me again. As the sedan pulled away and disappeared down the street, I had the strange feeling that the city had just shifted slightly around me. At the time, I thought it was simply coincidence that Adrian kept appearing when I needed a ride. I had no idea that. Nothing about him was coincidence at all. After that night, I started noticing a strange pattern in my routine. Every time my shift ended and I stepped outside the hotel under the tall glowing sign, the same black sedan seemed to be waiting somewhere along the curb. At first I told myself it was coincidence. Chicago was a busy city and drivers moved constantly between downtown and the north side. But after the fourth night in a row, coincidence started to feel less convincing. I would open the rideshare app and there it was again, Adrian's name appearing on the screen like the city had quietly decided he was responsible for getting me home. The third week it became something almost comfortable. I would finish my shift, tie my coat tighter against the cool Lake Michigan wind, and step outside knowing the quiet car would be there. Adrian never greeted me with dramatic conversation. He simply nodded once in the mirror and pulled away from the curb with that same calm precision. It felt different from every other ride I had taken in my life. There was no rushed small talk, no loud music playing from the radio, no driver complaining about traffic. Just the steady hum of the engine and the city lights sliding past the windows like reflections on water. One night the temperature dropped suddenly, and the air carried that sharp, early winter bite Chicago was famous for. I stepped into the car rubbing my hands together, and Adrian reached toward the center console without a word. Warm air began flowing from the vents a second later. You always think ahead, I said with a small smile. Adrian glanced at me briefly through the mirror. Cold weather arrives faster near the lake, he said calmly. It is better to prepare. I laughed softly. You sound like a weather expert. Observation, he replied simply. That was another thing about him. Adrian never talked more than necessary, but when he did speak his words always sounded deliberate, like each one had been weighed before leaving his mouth. Over time our conversations grew slightly longer. I learned he preferred driving at night because the city was quieter and people were more honest when they were tired. He learned that I worked double shifts most weekends to keep my small apartment and pay off my student loans. The strange part was how easily the silence between us felt natural. Most people tried to fill quiet moments with meaningless conversation, but Adrian never did. Sometimes we would drive 10 minutes without speaking at all, and somehow it felt peaceful instead of awkward. One evening the traffic near the river slowed to a crawl because of construction lights flashing across the bridge. The car in front of us honked impatiently, but Adrian remained completely relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. That was when I noticed the watch on his wrist for the first time. It caught the streetlight in a brief silver reflection, the kind of subtle shine you only saw on something expensive. Much more expensive than anything I had ever owned. I looked away quickly because staring felt rude, but the thought stayed in my mind. Drivers usually wore practical watches, or none at all. Adrian's looked like it belonged in a glass display inside one of the luxury stores on Michigan Avenue. The traffic cleared, and the car glided forward again. You look like you noticed something, Adrian said quietly. I blinked, surprised. What do you mean? Most people change their expression when they become curious, he replied. I laughed again, shaking my head. You really do observe everything. Adrian did not answer right away. His eyes remained focused on the road ahead, calm and unreadable. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the ride ended. Observation helps a person understand who people truly are. I stepped out of the car a few minutes later and watched the black sedan disappear into the quiet Chicago street once again. At that moment, I still believed Adrian was simply the most attentive driver in the city. I did not realize that every detail he noticed about the world around him came from a life far more complicated than driving strangers home at midnight. By the fourth week, Adrian had become part of my nightly routine the same way the glowing hotel sign and the smell of fresh coffee in the lobby had. I would finish stacking trays behind the restaurant counter, untie my apron, and step outside into the cool Chicago air, already expecting to see the quiet black sedan waiting somewhere near the curb. Most nights it was there, parked beneath a street lamp, engine running softly like it had been patiently waiting the entire time. One evening, the wind coming off Lake Michigan was stronger than usual, carrying the sharp smell of winter through the streets. I hurried toward the car and slipped into the back seat, grateful for the warm air inside. Adrian glanced at me through the rearview mirror and gave a small nod that had become his version of a greeting. Cold tonight, I said, rubbing my hands together. Winter is arriving early, he replied calmly. The car eased into traffic, passing rows of glowing storefronts and restaurants that were beginning to close for the night. The city felt quieter than usual, the streets glistening under the streetlights after a brief evening drizzle. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. That had become normal. The silence between us felt comfortable, like a shared understanding that conversation was optional. I watched the reflections of passing lights slide across the car window while the engine hummed steadily beneath us. Then something unexpected happened. As we stopped at a red light near a small diner on the corner, a young man stepped off the sidewalk and walked directly toward the car. At first I assumed he was simply crossing the street, but he stopped beside Adrian's window and leaned down slightly as if he recognized the driver. Adrian lowered the window halfway, and the cool night air slipped inside. "Good evening," the stranger said politely. His tone carried a surprising amount of respect. Adrian responded with a calm nod. "Good evening." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but I noticed the way the man straightened his posture slightly while speaking, almost like someone addressing a supervisor at work. The light changed, and Adrian raised the window again before guiding the car smoothly through the intersection. I glanced toward the mirror, curiosity slipping into my voice. "Do you know him?" Adrian's expression remained unreadable. "Someone who recognized the car," he said simply. The answer felt incomplete, but I did not press further. A few minutes later, we turned onto a quieter street lined with small apartment buildings and dim porch lights. As the car slowed near my building, I noticed another detail that made me pause. Across the street, a dark SUV sat parked with its engine running. Two men inside seemed to look toward Adrian's car the moment we pulled up. The observation lasted only a second before Adrian parked along the curb and shifted the car into park. "You are home," he said calmly. I reached for the door handle, but the image of the SUV stayed in my mind. "You ever notice strange things like that?" I asked. Adrian tilted his head slightly. "What things?" "People watching your car," I said with a small laugh. "It feels like they recognized you." Adrian's eyes met mine briefly through the mirror. His voice remained steady when he answered. "In a large city, people are always watching something." The explanation sounded reasonable enough, yet the calm certainty in his tone made it feel like he understood far more than he was saying. I stepped out of the car, and the cold air wrapped around me again. The black sedan pulled away a moment later, disappearing quietly down the street, while the dark SUV across the road slowly drove in the opposite direction. Standing on the sidewalk outside my apartment building, I suddenly realized something strange about Adrian. For someone who claimed to simply drive people around the city, he seemed to move through Chicago like a man who owned more of it than he was willing to admit. I started noticing more details after that night. Once you begin seeing small things, it becomes impossible to stop. The next evening, when Adrian's car pulled up outside the hotel, the headlights reflected across the wet pavement like quiet signals guiding me toward the curb. I stepped into the back seat and closed the door, immediately noticing the familiar calm atmosphere inside the car. The city noise faded the moment the door shut, leaving only the soft hum of the engine and the distant rhythm of traffic outside. Long shift again? Adrian asked gently. Always, I replied with a tired smile. People drink more coffee when it gets colder. Adrian nodded slightly as he guided the car into the late-night traffic. We moved slowly past glowing storefront windows and quiet restaurants preparing to close for the night. Chicago after midnight had a different personality. The loud daytime energy faded into something calmer and more reflective, like the city itself was finally exhaling after a long day. For several minutes we rode in silence again. I watched the skyline drifting past the window while street lights traced long reflections across the glass. Then another small detail caught my attention. When Adrian adjusted his hand on the steering wheel, the silver watch on his wrist flashed under the passing light again. I had noticed it before, but this time I looked more carefully. The design was elegant and minimal, the kind of craftsmanship you usually saw displayed inside luxury jewelry stores behind locked glass cases. It did not look like something a rideshare driver would casually wear during late-night shifts. I tried not to stare, but curiosity crept into my voice anyway. "That is a nice watch," I said casually. Adrian glanced toward the mirror for a brief second. "A gift," he answered simply. "From someone important?" I asked. For a moment I thought he might ignore the question, but instead he gave a quiet half-smile. "You could say that." The conversation ended there, but the thought stayed with me. A few minutes later we passed through a brighter part of downtown, where tall office buildings reflected the lights of passing cars. As we slowed near another intersection, something else unusual happened. A man standing outside a closed restaurant turned toward the car as we stopped at the red light. The moment he saw Adrian behind the wheel, he straightened his posture and gave a respectful nod through the windshield. Adrian returned the gesture with the smallest movement of his head before the light changed and the car rolled forward again. I leaned forward slightly in my seat. "You seem to know a lot of people around the city," I said. Adrian kept his eyes on the road ahead. "Chicago is a city where people recognize familiar faces," he replied calmly. The answer sounded reasonable, but there was something about the way he said it that made the explanation feel incomplete. A few blocks later we reached my apartment building again. Adrian parked along the curb, and the engine settled into a soft idle. I reached for the door handle, but paused before opening it. "You know something?" I said thoughtfully. "For a driver, you seem surprisingly calm about everything." Adrian met my eyes briefly in the mirror, his expression composed as always. "Driving teaches patience," he said. I stepped out of the car and watched the black sedan glide away once more into the quiet Chicago night. Standing on the sidewalk under the dim porch light of my building, I realized the small questions about Adrian were slowly adding up. His watch, the people who recognized him, the calm confidence in every movement he made. None of it matched the simple explanation of a man who spent his nights driving strangers home for a living. I began to suspect that Adrian knew exactly when my shifts ended. Not in an obvious way, not like someone watching the hotel doors, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood patterns better than most people. That Friday night the lobby had been busier than usual because a conference had filled the hotel with travelers carrying suitcases and tired expressions. By the time I finally finished stacking the last trays behind the counter, the large clock above the bar read almost midnight. My feet ached the way they always did after a long shift, and the thought of my small apartment and a warm shower felt like the only thing keeping me awake. When I pushed open the hotel doors, the cold night air wrapped around me instantly. Chicago had slipped deeper into winter. The wind moved through the buildings in long, quiet gusts, carrying the distant sound of traffic along Michigan Avenue. And just like the nights before, the same black sedan waited at the curb under the glow of a street lamp. I climbed into the back seat and closed the door, feeling the warmth of the car surround me. Adrian glanced at me in the mirror and gave the familiar nod. "Busy night?" he asked calmly. "You could say that," I replied, letting out a tired breath. "I think half the city decided to stay at the hotel tonight." Adrian pulled away from the curb, and the car merged into the quiet traffic flowing through downtown. For a few minutes we drove in comfortable silence while the lights of the city drifted past the windows. Then Adrian spoke again. "I need to make a stop near the airport tonight," he said. His voice remained calm, as if mentioning the weather. I leaned forward slightly in my seat. "The airport?" "Yes," he replied. "Someone asked me to check on a vehicle stored in a private hangar." I raised an eyebrow with a small laugh. "That sounds much more interesting than driving tired waitresses home." Adrian's expression in the mirror did not change, but I noticed the faintest hint of amusement in his eyes. "It will only take a few minutes," he continued. "If you do not mind a short detour." I thought about the quiet apartment waiting for me and the long night of sleep I had been looking forward to. But curiosity was a powerful thing, especially after weeks of noticing strange details that never quite added up. "Honestly," I said with a small shrug, "I have never seen the private side of the airport before. It might be interesting." Adrian nodded once as if the decision had already been expected. The car changed direction smoothly, turning away from the downtown streets and heading toward the highway that led out toward O'Hare International Airport. The skyline slowly faded behind us, replaced by long stretches of road illuminated by rows of bright overhead lights. The ride felt different tonight. Not uncomfortable, just quieter than usual, like the city itself was holding its breath. After nearly 20 minutes, the car left the main highway and turned onto a smaller road that curved toward a cluster of large hangars standing in the distance. Tall metal buildings lined the edge of the runway, their doors wide enough to swallow entire airplanes. Adrian slowed the car as we approached a secured gate where a guard stood beneath a bright overhead light. The guard looked toward the sedan, and something unexpected happened. Instead of stopping the car or asking questions, the guard stepped aside immediately and lifted the gate without hesitation. The car rolled forward into the private hangar area as if it belonged there. I leaned forward in my seat, watching the gate close behind us. "You must come here a lot," I said. Adrian did not answer right away. His eyes remained focused on the road ahead while the hangars grew larger in the windshield. Finally, he spoke in the same calm voice I had come to recognize. "Not as often as you might think." At that moment, I still believed we were simply stopping so Adrian could check on someone else's vehicle. I had no idea that within the next few minutes I was about to see the first real clue about the man who had been driving me home every night. The car moved slowly between the large hangars, their metal walls rising on both sides like silent giants in the night. Bright floodlights illuminated the empty pavement, casting long shadows across the ground. I had never been this close to the private side of an airport before. Everything looked larger, quieter, and strangely more controlled than the crowded passenger terminals people usually saw. Adrian guided the sedan toward the far end of the hangar row where a massive building stood with its doors partially open. The interior lights spilled across the concrete outside, bright enough to reflect off the polished hood of the car. As we approached, I noticed two men standing near the entrance wearing dark coats. They turned toward the car immediately, and something about the way they stood caught my attention. It was the same posture I had seen before in the city. Alert, respectful, like they were waiting for someone important. Adrian slowed the car to a smooth stop about 20 feet from the hangar entrance. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The engine idled softly while the cool night air outside carried the distant sound of aircraft moving somewhere across the runway. One of the men stepped forward slightly and gave a short nod toward the driver's seat. Not toward me, toward Adrian. I leaned forward a little in the back seat, curiosity building in my chest. "This place is bigger than I expected," I said quietly. Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he reached forward and turned off the engine. The quiet that followed felt heavier than before, like the entire hangar area had suddenly paused. Then he opened his door and stepped out of the car. I watched through the window as the two men near the entrance straightened immediately when he approached. One of them spoke, but I could not hear the words through the glass. Adrian nodded once in response, calm and composed the same way he always looked behind the wheel. The conversation lasted only a few seconds before the man stepped aside and gestured toward the open hangar behind him. Curiosity pulled me toward the window. I shifted slightly in the back seat and looked past Adrian into the brightly lit interior of the hangar. At first, all I saw were tools, equipment carts, and the wide concrete floor stretching into the distance. Then my eyes adjusted to the light, and I noticed something enormous standing inside. A sleek white aircraft rested in the center of the hangar, its polished body reflecting the overhead lights like glass. The wings extended across the space with quiet power, and the tall tail rose high, enough to nearly touch the ceiling. It was not a commercial airplane. It was smaller, more elegant, the kind of aircraft I had only seen in magazines about billionaires and celebrities. A private jet. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to process what I was looking at. Adrian spoke briefly with the two men before walking a few steps closer to the aircraft, as if inspecting it. The men followed slightly behind him with the same respectful distance I had noticed before. That was when one of them said something that drifted faintly through the open hangar door. "Everything is ready, Mr. Volkov." The name hung in the air for a moment before my mind caught up with it. Mr. Volkov. I sat frozen in the back seat, staring through the windshield while Adrian stood calmly in front of the aircraft like it belonged there. Like he belonged there. And suddenly, every strange detail from the past few weeks came rushing back into my mind at once. The watch. The men who recognized him. The way security guards stepped aside without asking questions. Adrian turned slightly toward the car, and for the first time since I had met him, I realized something simple and undeniable. The man who had been quietly driving me home every night was not just a driver at all. I sat frozen in the back seat, staring through the windshield while the bright hangar lights reflected across the glass. The white aircraft stood in the center of the building like something from another world, polished and silent beneath the ceiling lamps. A private jet. The words echoed quietly in my mind, refusing to settle into anything that made sense. Adrian stood several yards away near the nose of the aircraft, speaking calmly with the two men who had greeted him. Even from a distance, I could see the subtle change in the way they carried themselves around him. Their posture was straight, their movements careful, like they understood they were standing beside someone important. I replayed the moment in my head again. "Everything is ready, Mr. Volkov." The name still sounded strange. Until that second, Adrian had only been Adrian. A quiet driver with a calm voice and a watch that cost more than my monthly rent. Now the pieces were shifting into a shape that felt completely different. Adrian finished speaking with the men and began walking back toward the car. His steps were steady and unhurried, the same controlled movement I had seen every night behind the wheel. But now that I knew what was inside the hangar behind him, every step carried a different weight. The driver's door opened, and Adrian settled back into the seat, as if nothing unusual had happened. The car door closed with the same quiet sound it always made, sealing the warm interior around us again. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could still see the bright hangar lights through the windshield and the outline of the jet standing silently inside. Finally, I broke the silence. "That is your plane," I said softly. It was not really a question. Adrian rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel before answering. "Yes." The word came calmly, without hesitation, like he had already expected this conversation. I leaned forward slightly, trying to understand the man I had spent weeks talking to. "You told me you were a driver," I said. Adrian turned the key and the engine came to life again with a smooth hum. His eyes met mine briefly in the mirror. "I am driving you home," he replied. The answer made me laugh once in disbelief. "That is not what I meant." Adrian guided the car slowly away from the hangar entrance while the two men stepped aside to clear the path. As we rolled past them, both gave small respectful nods toward the driver's seat again. The moment only confirmed what I was beginning to realize. Adrian Volkov was not just another man working night shifts in Chicago. We passed through the same gate where the guard immediately lifted the barrier again without asking a single question. The car returned to the quiet road outside the private hangar area, the distant airport lights fading behind us as we drove back toward the highway. I watched Adrian carefully through the mirror, noticing how nothing about his expression had changed. The same calm eyes, the same steady posture. "Why pretend?" I asked after several minutes. The city skyline began to reappear faintly on the horizon as we approached downtown again. Adrian thought for a moment before answering. "Because people speak more honestly when they believe you are ordinary." The words hung in the air between us while the car moved smoothly through the dark highway lanes. I leaned back against the seat, trying to absorb the truth that had been hiding in front of me the entire time. Every quiet ride, every small detail I had ignored. Adrian Volkov had never been the man I thought he was. And suddenly the city outside the window looked very different than it had an hour earlier. The highway lights stretched across the windshield like long golden lines guiding us back toward the city. Chicago's skyline slowly grew larger ahead of us, glass towers rising against the dark sky as if nothing unusual had happened tonight. But inside the car, everything felt different. The quiet space that had once felt simple and ordinary now carried a strange weight. I watched Adrian through the rearview mirror, studying the calm expression that had never changed since the moment we left the hangar. The same steady hands on the steering wheel. The same controlled movements. Only now I understood that the man behind the wheel owned far more than the car he was driving. "You have a plane," I said finally, my voice quieter than I expected. Adrian kept his eyes on the road. "Yes." The answer came without pride or explanation. Just a simple statement. I let out a small breath and leaned back into the seat. People do not usually drive strangers home at midnight when they own airplanes. Adrian turned the car smoothly onto the exit ramp leading back toward downtown. "People do many things that others find unusual," he replied calmly. The city lights began reflecting across the windows again as traffic grew thicker around us. I watched the familiar streets return, but the normal comfort of the ride was gone. Every detail I had ignored before now felt important. The expensive watch. The men who greeted him with respect. The security guard who lifted the gate without asking a single question. None of those things belonged to an ordinary driver. "So who are you really?" I asked. Adrian remained silent for several seconds while the car passed beneath a row of streetlights. Their glow moved across his face in brief flashes before fading again into shadow. Finally he answered, "My name is Adrian Volkov." I waited for him to continue, but he did not. The name alone seemed to carry enough meaning for him. Unfortunately, it meant nothing to me. "That does not explain much," I said with a small smile. Adrian's eyes met mine briefly in the mirror. "It explains more than you realize." We drove another mile before curiosity pushed the next question out of me. "If you have a plane and people calling you Mr. Volkov, why spend your nights driving around Chicago?" Adrian's expression remained thoughtful as he considered the answer. "Because a car is one of the few places where people behave naturally," he said. "They speak about their lives without realizing anyone is listening." I tilted my head slightly. "So you study people?" Adrian allowed the smallest hint of amusement to appear in his voice. "You could say that." The car turned onto the familiar street near my apartment building. Porch lights glowed softly along the sidewalk, and the quiet neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had every night before. Adrian parked along the curb, and the engine settled into its gentle idle. For a moment, neither of us moved. I looked at the mirror again, trying to understand how someone who owned a private jet could sit calmly behind the wheel of a rideshare car without ever mentioning it. "You let me believe you were just a driver," I said. Adrian's eyes held the same calm certainty they always had. "You never asked anything different," he replied. The answer was so simple that I could not argue with it. I stepped out of the car, and the cool night air wrapped around me again. As the sedan pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street, one realization stayed firmly in my mind. Adrian Volkov had not lied to me. He had simply allowed me to believe the smallest possible version of who he really was. The next night felt different before I even stepped outside the hotel. Something about the quiet lobby, the way the clock above the bar ticked slowly past 11:30, made the evening feel heavier than usual. I finished wiping down the last table and untied my apron, but my mind kept returning to the image of the aircraft inside that bright hangar. Adrian standing beside it like it belonged to him. Because it did. When I finally stepped through the hotel doors, the cold air rushed against my face, and the familiar black sedan waited at the curb beneath the street lamp. For a moment, I stood on the sidewalk without moving. Just 24 hours earlier, I would have walked straight to the car without thinking twice. Now everything about it felt different. The car door opened automatically as I approached, just like always. I slid into the back seat and closed the door quietly. Adrian glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His expression had not changed at all. Calm. Observant. Exactly the same man who had been driving me home every night for weeks. "Good evening, Emily," he said. "Good evening," I replied. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into the steady stream of downtown traffic. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The city lights moved across the windows while my mind replayed everything I had learned the night before. Finally, I leaned forward slightly in the seat. "You could have told me," I said. Adrian kept his eyes on the road ahead. "You did not ask," he replied in the same calm voice. I let out a quiet breath and shook my head with a small smile. "That seems to be your favorite answer." Adrian allowed a faint hint of amusement to appear in the mirror. "It is usually the honest one." We drove another block before curiosity pushed the next question forward. "So what exactly do you do?" I asked. Adrian slowed the car at a red light and rested his hands lightly on the steering wheel. The glow of the signal reflected across the windshield while he considered the question. I manage several companies, he said finally. The answer sounded careful. Measured. Companies that own airplanes? I asked. Adrian nodded once. Among other things. The light turned green, and the car moved forward again. I leaned back into the seat, studying the skyline outside the window. Glass towers reflected the city lights like mirrors stretching into the dark sky. You know, I said thoughtfully, most people would mention something like that earlier in the conversation. Adrian's voice remained calm. Most people enjoy being treated differently once others know their position. I looked toward the mirror again. And you do not. Adrian shook his head slightly. No. The answer came without hesitation. After a moment, he added quietly, for the first time in a long while I was speaking to someone who did not expect anything from me. The words hung in the quiet car while the streets passed outside. I understood what he meant. When I first stepped into the back seat weeks earlier, Adrian had simply been another driver in a city full of drivers. I had spoken freely because I believed there was nothing unusual about him. So you kept driving me home because it was normal? I asked. Adrian considered the question for a moment before answering. Because it was honest. The car turned onto my street again, the quiet neighborhood appearing under soft porch lights. Adrian parked along the curb, and the engine settled into its familiar idle. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then I opened the door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. As the car pulled away and disappeared down the street once more, I realized something unexpected. The truth about Adrian Volkov had not made him feel like a stranger. Somehow it had only made the mystery around him grow even deeper. The following evening, the air over Chicago felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that settles over the city just before winter truly arrives. When my shift ended and I stepped outside the hotel doors, I noticed the familiar black sedan waiting along the curb exactly where it had been every night before. Somehow that small detail had become comforting, like a constant in a city that changed every hour. I walked toward the car and slipped into the back seat, closing the door softly behind me. Adrian glanced at me through the mirror and nodded once. Good evening, Emily. Good evening, I replied. The car eased into traffic, merging smoothly with the slow flow of headlights moving down the avenue. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The skyline shimmered across the windshield while the city lights reflected off the wet pavement. Eventually, I leaned forward slightly in my seat. Can I ask you something? Adrian's eyes remained calm in the mirror. You may ask. I hesitated for a moment before speaking. Why keep driving at all? I said. If you manage companies and own airplanes, you could spend your evenings doing anything else. Adrian considered the question while the car rolled through another intersection. The glow of a street lamp passed across his face before fading again. Because driving shows you the truth about a city, he said finally. You see where people live, where they work, where they return when the day is finished. I looked out the window as rows of apartment buildings passed by, their windows glowing softly in the night. That sounds almost philosophical, I said with a small smile. Adrian allowed the faintest hint of amusement to appear in his voice. Observation has always been useful. We drove another few blocks before I noticed something unusual ahead. A dark sedan sat parked across the street near my apartment building, its headlights off, but its engine clearly running. The moment Adrian's car turned onto the street, the other vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb and drove past us in the opposite direction. Adrian's eyes followed it briefly in the mirror before returning to the road. Friends of yours? I asked casually. Adrian's answer came calm and steady. No. The word carried just enough weight to make me glance toward the mirror again. He looked thoughtful for a moment, then spoke again in a quieter voice. Some people are curious about things that do not belong to them. I was not entirely sure what he meant, but the sentence stayed in the air between us while the car rolled the final few yards to the curb. Adrian parked beside the sidewalk in front of my building, and the engine settled into its familiar gentle idle. I reached for the door handle, but paused before stepping out. You make the city sound like a chessboard, I said thoughtfully. Adrian looked back at me through the mirror, his expression calm but serious. Every large city is one, he replied. Most people simply do not notice the game. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and watched the black sedan disappear down the street once again. As the taillights faded into the distance, I realized something I had not considered before. Adrian Volkov might have chosen to drive through the city to observe it quietly, but the city was beginning to notice him as well. And somehow I had been placed right in the middle of that quiet attention without realizing it. The following night, the wind over Chicago carried the sharp chill of early winter, the kind that moved through the streets like a quiet warning that the season was changing. My shift ended a little earlier than usual, and when I stepped out of the hotel doors, the street looked calmer than it had in weeks. The usual late-night traffic had thinned, leaving long stretches of pavement glowing under the streetlights. Adrian's black sedan waited at the curb just as it always did, the engine humming softly like it had been expecting me all along. I opened the door and slipped into the back seat, brushing the cold air from my coat. Adrian glanced at me through the mirror and gave the familiar nod. "Good evening, Emily." "Good evening," I replied. The car pulled away from the curb and moved into the quiet avenue, passing rows of tall buildings that reflected the city lights like glass mirrors. For several blocks we rode in silence, the calm atmosphere inside the car settling around us again. But tonight something felt slightly different. Adrian's attention seemed sharper, his eyes scanning the road ahead with more focus than usual. Eventually he spoke. "Did anyone unusual approach you at the hotel today?" I blinked in surprise. "No," I said slowly. "Why?" Adrian paused for a moment before answering. Curiosity travels quickly in a city like this. I thought about the dark sedan that had been parked across the street the night before and the way it had quietly pulled away when we arrived. "You think someone was watching?" I asked. Adrian did not answer directly. Instead, he guided the car through a slow turn toward the river where the lights of downtown reflected across the water like scattered gold. "There are people who like to understand how others move through the city," he said calmly. "Especially when those movements become predictable." I leaned forward slightly in my seat, suddenly aware of how routine my nights had become. Same hotel, same time, same ride home. Adrian had mentioned before that cities worked like chessboards. Perhaps patterns mattered more than I realized. The car crossed the bridge over the river, the skyline rising tall and bright beyond it. Adrian's voice broke the silence again. "It may be better if your schedule changes slightly for a few days." I frowned gently. "My schedule? Leaving the hotel earlier or later," he said. "Small changes often discourage unnecessary attention." The suggestion sounded strange, but the calm certainty in his tone made it difficult to argue. "You really think someone cares about when I leave work?" I asked. Adrian's eyes met mine briefly in the mirror. "People are rarely interested in ordinary things," he replied. "They are interested in connections." The word lingered in the quiet car, while the city lights moved across the windows again. Connections. I suddenly understood what he meant. Anyone paying attention would not be watching me alone. They would be watching the pattern between us. The woman leaving the hotel every night. The same black sedan waiting for her. The car turned onto my street once again and slowed beside the familiar curb in front of my apartment building. Adrian parked, and the engine settled into its gentle idle. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I opened the door and stepped onto the sidewalk. Before closing it, I glanced back toward the driver's seat. "You really do see the city differently than the rest of us," I said quietly. Adrian's expression remained calm, but his voice carried a quiet certainty. "Because I know how quickly quiet things can become visible." The car pulled away a moment later, disappearing down the dim street while the porch lights along the sidewalk flickered softly in the cold wind. Standing there alone, I realized something important. Adrian had been watching the city carefully for years. But now the city had begun watching us too. The next evening the city looked exactly the same, but I no longer saw it the way I once had. The hotel lights still glowed above the entrance. Taxis still rolled past the curb, and the cold Chicago wind still moved between the tall buildings like a quiet river of air. Yet everything felt slightly different now, like I had stepped into a version of the city where hidden patterns were suddenly visible. When my shift ended and I pushed open the hotel doors, the familiar black sedan waited beneath the street lamp once again. For a moment, I simply stood there on the sidewalk, watching the quiet car that had become part of my life without me realizing how unusual it truly was. Then I walked forward and opened the door, sliding into the back seat like I had done dozens of times before. Adrian glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His expression remained calm, thoughtful, unchanged by everything that had happened during the past few days. "Good evening, Emily," he said. "Good evening," I replied softly. The car pulled away from the curb, and joined the slow flow of traffic moving through downtown Chicago. For a while we rode in silence, the city lights drifting across the windows, while the skyline reflected against the dark sky. Eventually, Adrian spoke again. "Did you think about what we discussed yesterday?" I looked out at the glowing towers beside the river before answering. "Yes," I said, "about patterns and people watching them." Adrian nodded slightly, and I leaned forward in the seat, meeting his eyes through the mirror. "I realized something," I said. "If someone was paying attention to me, it was not because of who I am." Adrian remained quiet, allowing the thought to continue. "It was because of you," I finished. The car slowed briefly at a red light, and the glow of the signal reflected across the windshield. Adrian considered the words carefully before responding. "Possibly." The calm answer might have sounded distant to anyone else, but I had spent enough nights in that car to understand what it really meant. Adrian was not surprised. He had expected it long before I had. The light changed, and the car continued toward my neighborhood again. When we reached the quiet street in front of my apartment building, Adrian parked along the curb, and the engine settled into its gentle idle like it always did. For several seconds neither of us spoke. The porch lights along the sidewalk flickered softly while the wind moved the bare branches of a nearby tree. Finally, I opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement. Before closing it, I leaned down toward the open window beside the driver's seat. "You once said people speak honestly when they believe someone is ordinary," I said quietly. Adrian met my eyes with the same calm expression. "Yes." I smiled faintly. "Then I suppose I should thank you for the rides," I said. "Even if you were never really just a driver." Adrian watched me for a moment before answering. His voice carried the same quiet certainty it always had. "For you, Emily, I was exactly that." The words lingered in the cold air between us. Then the car door closed and the black sedan pulled away from the curb, disappearing down the dim Chicago street for the last time that winter. I stood there beneath the streetlight watching the taillights fade into the distance, realizing something simple and unexpected. In a city filled with powerful men and complicated lives, the one thing Adrian Volkov had truly chosen for himself had been the quiet hours spent driving. Through the night where no one treated him like anything more than a man behind the wheel.